Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Introduction to Project Budgets. For those of you who are returning Candid webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you who are here for the first time, I'm so glad that you're joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Cebada, and I'm a program specialist for Candid based in our New York Learning Center. And I'll be supporting today's webinar behind the scenes, as well as collecting questions that you pose along the way, asking those during our brief Q&A, as well as administering a few polls that we have for you today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I want to share with you that about a year ago, Candid came to be through the formation of GuideStar and Foundation Center coming together. In light of the current moment, we have put together a response for COVID-19 because we do know that even though everyone is still learning how to deal with the arising challenges that the present moment brings, many folks are still trying to make sure that they can get in any learning that they can throughout the way. So to prioritize the safety and health of our communities during this time, we've shifted many of our in-person programs to an online format. Today's training is certainly one of those. We've also put together a number of other resources, which I'll share in the link in the chat momentarily. As I mentioned, Candid came to be about a year ago, and as such, we did so because we wanted to be able to serve the nonprofit sector. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. We believe that an effective social sector is critical for a thriving society, and we believe in the importance of solutions for the sector, by the sector. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources that they need to do it. To stay up to date with any of our upcoming virtual trainings that we're putting together, we welcome you to follow us on social media, as well as subscribing to our Grant Space newsletter. I'd now like to turn the presentation over to our presenter, Catalina Spinel, Program Manager in our New York Learning Center as well. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Catalina.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be here with you all and share some knowledge around Introduction to Project Budgets. So with no further ado, let's dive into the course itself. Candid did a survey of grant makers, and 30% of those grant makers said that they look at the budget first before they even look at the project description. Do you know why this is the case? Basically, because the budget shows them immediately what the dollars will do and where their money is going. At Candid, we are aware that preparing a project budget, it's not most people's favorite thing to do. In today's class, we will show you how to create a general project budget and feel more confident about the process. After the class today, you'll have time to start your own project budget using the exercise handout provided for this class. Upon completion of this training, you should be able to explain the basic elements of a project budget, estimate a project expense and income, and follow up after your project is funded. Your proposal describes your project in narrative form. Your budget explains your project in financial terms. Because it is the first thing many grant makers would look like, usually along with the executive summary, it is important to have a thorough and complete budget. It doesn't have to be exact, but it should be a clear and realistic projection of what the project will cost. Your budget should include the estimate of the true cost of the project and your expected income to meet those costs. So let's look at the components of a typical project budget. Each grant maker is different and many have their own budget format. However, most grant makers will want to see a one-page summary of your financial projections, breaking down your project's income and expenses, including both direct and indirect costs. When we look at the income, this is your support and revenue. These costs are made up of grants and contributions, which include all grants from independent foundations, corporate and government grants, donations from individuals, and any other contributions. We also have earned income, which includes which includes income generated by charging fees for services or selling items or goods such as ticket sales or t-shirts, for example. Then moving on to expenses, this is how much your project costs. Direct costs are directly related to your specific project, meaning these expenses are used for or allocated to this project only. That's why they are called direct costs. These expenses include both personnel and non-personnel costs. Personnel includes all staff directly involved in the project, and I'll speak to that later on. Non-personnel includes all of the other expenses directly related to the project. And under expenses, we also have indirect costs. This is your overhead, and we will be talking about that in more detail. Now that you know the basic components, let's talk a little bit about the process one would go through to develop the project. But before we go and do that, we wanted to do a poll. So Elizabeth, I'll pass it to you so you can do the poll.
Thank you so much, Catalina. So the question that we're posing to everyone today is who should be involved in drafting the project budget? I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll so everyone should see the quick poll screen on their end. And this is a select all that apply. So should it be the executive director, perhaps finance and or accounting staff, the program manager, the board, and then the grant writer? So Catalina, it looks like we actually have a fairly wide distribution here. 92% of participants are sharing that the program manager should be involved, followed by, perhaps finance and accounting. And, depending on the executive director's role, they're definitely included in here, as well as the grant writer. But, only about less than 30% selected the board to be involved in the project budget process. Do you have any commentary here?
So what I was going to say is, well, thank you all for responding the question. I'm glad to see that less people are including the board. And while you want to keep your board informed of the financial status of your organization, and I know there's a broad range of organizations out there in terms of the size and number of employees, but most of the time the board should not be involved in the process of creating a budget for a specific project. Again, depending on how hands-on the board is and the relationship with the executive director, that might be the case. So I wouldn't want to say a definitely no, because there might be exceptions to the rule. But in general, the board should not be involved in this process. In terms of the other roles, I do agree that depending on the project and the organization, it's correct that the executive director, the finance and accounting staff should be involved, the program manager, and also the grant writer.
And Teresa is asking a very timely question here, which I hope you can cover in the next section of the presentation. And she wants to know who should lead the drafting of the project budget.
My sense is that the program manager, together with the finance team, I feel that they're so usually, and I feel let's continue on the conversation. So basically, if you know your project, you can plan your budget, and that's why I was saying that the program manager should be one of heavily involved, because basically what you're doing is you're translating what you're going to be doing into numbers, and the program manager usually knows what needs to go into the program for it to be successful. So they're going to be able to translate that into dollars. Having said that, we also want to include sometimes also the fundraising and then the program staff. I would say that two things that are important to keep in mind as you prepare the project budget is that your budget should be a mirror reflection of your proposal, and everything that is on your proposal should be represented in your budget. So how will I know how much my project costs? If this is a project that you have already implemented, you will have a good idea of how much it costs. But remember, costs go up, so be sure to account for inflation and or any other changes that you might do on the project. If this is a brand new project, no worries. There's a standard formula to estimate project costs. And in addition to that, we suggest that you, depending on the budget line item that you're looking, you research 3 estimates, collect and document each quote, and choose the estimate that is the most reasonable and appropriate for your project. So we're going to start by talking about personnel costs. How do you estimate them? So personnel costs will most likely be the largest component of your budget because it takes the right people to manage and implement a project successfully. So first, list all of the employees who will spend time on the project. Then estimate what percentage of their time they will dedicate to the project. If it's the executive director, for example, they may only spend 10% of their time on the project, while the program director might spend 100% of their time on the project. Next, you will need the amount of their annual salaries or hourly wages. So in the example of the executive director, you calculate and allocate the portion of their salary this project will cover. So for example, if the executive director spends 10% of their time on this project and she makes $60,000 a year, the amount you would put in your budget for this line item would be $6,000. In addition to salaries, you should also include the cost of benefits. For example, if you offer health benefits or disability benefits, you can include a percentage of their employees' contribution for providing those benefits. If your organization offers benefits, typically your accountant or finance person will know what your fringe benefits rate is, and you can add that amount to your budget. And that goes into the poll question on who should you involve as part of the project budget. So in this case, when you're calculating the fringe, we always recommend that you connect with your finance team. If you don't have a finance team, we recommend that then you add up those benefits. As I mentioned, some of those benefits could include disability insurance, the employer's portion of Medicare and Social Security tax, health insurance, life insurance, pension plans contributions, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation insurance, amongst others, and then find that rate for your own organization. Now let's do the same for non-personnel costs, otherwise known as everything else. Every project is different, so every budget will be different. Here we have a sample of non-personnel costs. Your list will be unique to your project, but this is a good list to start. Often, a budget will include costs for consultants or independent contractors. You should include this after your regular salary cost, but be sure not to apply the benefit rate since consultants typically do not receive benefits. If your project includes volunteers, hold on that thought. We'll be getting to that in just a minute. Think of every possible expense you might have with an estimated dollar value. Include as many of the potential costs and incidental costs as you can think of. For example, if you have a line item for travel, what would this include? So there we could have gas, mileage, airplane tickets, maybe hotel, foods, and again, I would reiterate that these are just examples. Each project is unique, so you would have to tailor it to your own specific project. Then you would add it all up, and now you will have the non-personnel total. When you add the personnel total and the non-personnel total, you have the total sum of direct costs. Great job. You're almost done. But don't forget to add a line. What is still missing, it's indirect costs or overhead. So what are indirect costs? What do we mean when we say that? So usually is the cost of doing business, costs not directly attributed to the project, but are necessary to sustain a project. So some of the things and that include indirect costs and how indirect costs are also known as include administrative costs, overhead costs, supportive services, operating costs, and others. So there we have rent, utilities, telephone, internet, office supplies, marketing and communication, administrative staff, fundraising. And these costs are often called different things by different people. So there, as I've mentioned, indirect costs are also known as administrative costs, overhead costs, supportive services, and operating costs, and hidden costs. So a good way to understand the difference between direct cost and indirect cost is the iceberg. So everyone, including grant makers, can visualize the project and its anticipated impact. But the hidden costs are what keeps the organization running. Some grant makers will not fund indirect costs at all. And the thing, why do you think, and I know that people, that this is the everlasting request from nonprofits to be funded for general support. But usually funders do not fund us for general support because it's hard to see the impact of that money. Having said that, some grant makers that do fund indirect costs may put specific limits on how much they will fund, and many may allow a specific percentage of overhead costs. No matter what, you should always follow the grant maker's guidelines, and as you plan for the project budget, be mindful of the grant maker guidelines. So how do you calculate your organization indirect cost rate? First, refer to your organization annual budget and calculate the total sum of direct costs for all programs. For example, if your organization has a youth leadership program with direct cost of $200,000 and a college prep program with direct costs of $300,000, your total direct costs would be $500,000. Next, calculate the sum of all your organization's indirect costs. In this case, that total is $100,000. Next, divide the total indirect costs by your total direct costs, and you have your organization indirect cost rate. For example, here, the indirect cost rate is 20%, and you can add that percentage to your total direct costs for your grand total. So let's go look back to our components of a project budget. Now you have the grand total of your project expenses, so let's move on to the income side. Remember, income makes up both your support and revenue. As we discussed earlier, support is any contribution for your project. Revenue is earned income. Just as you lay out the expenses for your project, you will also need to show your income as well. Each project is different, but here is an example of how you could show your income. You may not be receiving all of these types of income, and that's okay. You will only need to list what applies to your specific project or organization. So first, we have grants and contributions. Here, you will want to include any contribution you have received from local, state, or federal government, independent foundation, or corporate grants. These should only be confirmed grants, not pending requests. As a separate part of your budget, some grant makers may ask for pending requests. Typically, that is outlined or listed as a separate attachment to your budget. And I'm going to repeat that because I feel that that's something where many NGOs or us, from what we've seen as we teach this class, this is something that they struggle. So when you're adding your grants and contributions, you should include only confirmed grants, not pending requests. And depending on the grant maker, if they're asking for it, just add them on a separate attachment to your budget. So let's move on. If you receive support from individual donors, that would also be included under contributions, but it is not necessarily to list each individual, just the total amount received. And there you see the individual line on the budget. You'll also want to include any support you may have received from federated giving program, such as the United Way or Combined Federal Campaign. Then we go to earned income. Earned income includes fees for services or the sales of goods. This could be tickets to an event, the sales of publications or products, or fees with direct services such as student registration fees or tuition, museum entrance fees, or fees charged for tours. For example, here at Candid, our earned income comes from the sale of our free paid for classes and webinars and subscription to our databases. So for those organizations that charge membership fees and dues, you would include that line as well. If it's applicable to your organization, you want to include those too. And then lastly, we have in-kind support. So for those of you that might not know what in-kind contributions are, basically these are gifts that are not monetary in nature. We see, let's say, for many educational programs, that could be a computer, that could be art supplies, and there is an ongoing list of what that in-kind support would look like. And a lot of time when we think about in-kind contributions, we think about goods, products, or equipment, but there you should also include pro bono services, volunteer, or space. And then once you've added those and the ones that are relevant for your organization, we do have the total of income. So moving on and going a little bit deeper into the in-kind contributions, if your organization or the project that you're planning does receive in-kind support, say a donated space for your program, it should be shown as both an expense as an income. It should be shown both as an expense and as an income. So people ask me, okay, why do you include both expense and income? So the reason behind that is, even though you are receiving the space for free, it is still an expense for the program and needs to be reflected as such. And I think here, when we started the course and we said that you need to reflect the true cost, I think that this is also one of the examples where we show what that true cost means. So once you put the in-kind, then in the income, you also put it in the expense, and then they are going to balance each other out. So if you don't include the in-kind contributions as both an expense and as an income, then your budget will not reflect the true value of the project. If your project includes volunteers, you can visit independent sector website, and Elizabeth, if you have it, please share it with the audience, which is independentsector.org/volunteer time, and then you could also find how much that time can be translated into the current national dollar value rate for volunteer time. Here, you will also find a map which breaks down the dollar value for each state. For example, the current national value of a volunteer time is $25.43 per hour, as of the independent sector report released in April of 2019. So if you have a volunteer that will spend 10 hours in your project, you can put that person in your budget under income and expense for $264.30. In addition to your project budget, there are other financial documents grant makers may ask you for. So each grant maker is different, but we often see funders asking for audited financial statements, your most recent audited financial statements, organization-wide budgets for recent years, a list of supporters and other funding sources, your annual report, a budget narrative, a brief description that may accompany a budget but be used to clarify specific line items, explain how the cost was estimated, and or justify the need for the cost, your 990 form, and then remember to include everything the grant maker asks for, everything that the grant maker asks for, and very little of anything else. If you don't have something they require, be sure to give them a call to see if you can substitute something else in its place. Don't just leave it out. For example, if you don't have a financial audit, which may be very expensive to do, some grant makers will accept a financial review instead, which often costs less. And again, I feel that this depends also on the grant amount that you're applying for and the size of your organization. To make this process a little easier, when you're pressed for time, as we all are, we suggest you keep all these possible attachments in one place so they are easily accessible. This is sometimes called a document drawer. A document drawer isn't so much a drawer as it is an electronic folder where you would keep these documents. The point is that they are saved in one place and are ready to attach or print when it's time to submit your proposal. I suggest having them all saved in PDFs, but you may also want to keep hard copies of these documents, as well as make sure you always have the most up-to-date version in hand. So with that said, let's make a stop. And then again, Elizabeth is going to be doing a poll. We want to hear from you. So what should you do if you get the grant, but the project costs more than you expected?
Thank you so much, Catalina. So the poll is now live and you're able to participate on your screen. And we have a few options here. You know, perhaps you should call the project off because you're already over on your expenses here. The other option is, you know, telling the funder right away, you know, picking up that phone and having that uncomfortable conversation, you know, telling the funder in the year-end report, you know, you're still sharing that with them and maybe you're sharing, you know, the impact of that work as well. And if you're not sure, that's a perfectly acceptable answer. Again, we're in an introductory course here, so we're all here to learn kind of the do's and don'ts of putting together a project budget and what to do when you accidentally go over what you expected. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close our poll and share those results. And 71% of the room is sharing that they should tell the funder right away. 15% of the room says definitely tell the funder in the year-end report. 14% of the room is not sure. Any thoughts here, Catalina?
Well, I'm happy to hear that nobody's calling the project off. I feel that you've already started. And then I do feel that once you apply for, since you start prospecting and applying for a grant, you're expected to have a close relationship with your with the grant maker. So I do agree that you should tell the funder right away. Having said that, I would say it also depends on how much the project is going to cost. You know, I would say if it's a significant amount, yes, definitely go right away and tell the funder because you want to keep them posted. And then also, hopefully by that time, you know, and or have alternatives to cover that cost. So many grant funders don't have the capacity to pay for that overhead. So I would recommend, like, you think, okay, how can I get those additional funds based on the other sources of income that your organization might have. But then again, if it's a couple of $100, as other people are saying, you might just want to tell the funder at the end of year report and then just always keep them posted, not just when things don't go as planned, but then also your early wins and things as you start supporting your communities or the work that you're doing, keep them informed of how you're advancing that work. So one thing, and I feel that the question you asked sets the stage. Okay, we applied for the budget, for the grant, we got the grant, and then what happens if it's approved? So let's assume for a second that your project was funded. So first of all, congratulations. We all know that it's a very competitive process. So congratulations, your proposal was accepted, but you're not done with the project budget yet. So what does this mean? So your budget is something to be considered throughout the grant period. The budget becomes an essential project management tool as you implement your project. You will observe and monitor how the grant is being spent. And then remember that you're going to have to report back to the grant maker during and or after the grant period has ended. And they're going to want to know your actual costs versus your projected costs. Most likely, they will ask you to include a comparison between what you've submitted with your initial proposal and what you actually spent. Many times, funders require that you explain any significant variances and often require approval. And that goes to the question, you know, sort of always be mindful of the guidelines provided by the grant maker. And once you receive the funds, make sure that the expectations in terms of reporting the spending are clear. Sometimes, depending on the funder, they might want to be very specific and then they might ask for certain receipts or certain information. And then there are others that are less hands-on and require less documentation. So always be mindful because as you develop the project, you want to continue gathering that information for the report at the end of the project. So with that said, before we move on, I don't know, Elizabeth, if you would like to share some of the questions that people are posing. I would love to hear from the audience and what they're thinking.
Absolutely. We've definitely gotten plenty of questions coming in, but I thought it might actually be helpful to start with questions coming in from organizations that are just getting off the ground. So, really thinking about how do you put dollar amounts to a project that might be the very first time you're initiating. Is there a particular approach that you would take to estimating, how much time someone might spend on a project, or, if you are getting estimates for, say, the computers that are going to be needed for that after school program, is there a best approach for, a startup nonprofit to approach a budget that might differ from a more established organization?
So I would say there, going to what we were saying, I would say depending on which expense you're evaluating, and then depending on there, you should either get a quote and ask for what the value is. Ideally for 3, you could do an average. And I'm thinking specifically for the example that you provided on the computer. I'm thinking sometimes it's harder, let's say for salaries. I would recommend using relevant sources, and that varies based on the size of your organization, your geographical location, whether you're based in the US, if you're in a big city, or if you're in a rural area, that also is going to impact. And then also in which area your organization is working. So it's very different, or not very different, but the salaries might vary if you're an arts organization or if you're a culture organization. So take all those factors into account. And the way of doing it is you might ask peers. There's always a lot of information around peers, but then there are other resources on surveys, on salaries. There is a lot of things that you could look for relevant sources. Here at Candid, we have the compensation report. So that's a good starting point to look for salaries. And I would say that those are my initial thoughts. So do quotes, go out in the market and ask for whatever the expense is. So let's say, given the example of the computers, or for travel, or for hiring consultants, you could do that. And then for salaries, you could go for reports. And then lastly, you might want to ask people that have already gone that path. So maybe talking to other executive directors or other people that are doing similar work, that it's also a good starting point. I also would say, if possible, maybe you could, many of nonprofits publish their annual reports, and then I feel there that's also, you could look at a peer organization and look at what their financial looks like, and that could also be a good starting point to see what the budget might look like.
Thank you, Catalina. I think those are all really great recommendations. And we did share a link to our sample documents page on grantspace.org. And some of the proposals that are on there, all of the proposals on there have been funded, and some of them do include samples of budgets as well. So that might be a good place to start if there's a particular proposal on there that might be similar to the work that you're putting together. Another question that we had come in is, how much does it vary from one grant maker to another in terms of what they're asking for to be in a budget? I know we're sharing best practices here, but how much will the budget be customized from one grant maker to the other?
I think that's a great question. So thank you. And then the other one too. So thank you everyone for submitting their questions. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately just because we always say, if you know one funder, you know just one funder. So we don't like to generalize a specific approach, because that might not be the case yet. Even if there is a big trend of many funders doing a specific way, if you apply to the smaller one, then whatever advice we provide won't apply. I would say sometimes they do have their own template, and then funders ask you to fill in the template that they've provided. So if that's the case, follow the guidelines. And if not, use what works for your organization and what you've used. So long story short is, I think it's it's on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you so much, Catalina.
Any other questions?
Yeah, the next one that we have here comes from Ariana. And she's actually curious if most grant makers want to see a project budget, which is what we're talking about today, or if they also want to see an annual budget. When they use the word budget, without any specificity, can we make an assumption that they're referring to one or the other, or is it okay, to clarify with the grant maker, whether by phone call or email?
Could you repeat the question at the beginning? I want to make sure that I actually am conveying, I understand what the case is.
Do most grant makers want to see a project budget or an annual budget when they simply say they need to see a budget?
Perfect. So I'm assuming that this is in the context of a grant application, and that's a given with everything that we shared. So taking that assumption, meaning that you're applying for a grant and they're talking for the budget, they want to see the project budget, not the full budget of the organization. The full budget of the organization, that's when we were talking about the other financial information that the grant maker might ask, and that you should include based on what their guidelines are, that's when you would include the full organization budget. Okay, so before we move on to the key takeaways, I would love to hear if participants could share on the chat some of the key things that they've learned as we've had this conversation around project budgets. And while Elizabeth starts collecting some of those answers, I would say the key takeaways as you're taking this journey on doing a project budget, you should always know your project thoroughly, estimate all the direct costs, include a percentage for indirect costs, estimate all possible income. So, and Elizabeth already mentioned this, but I would say in terms of next steps, we're going to continue. We're going to talk a little bit more of a specific example. And then we're going to, if you want, you could look for sample budgets on GrantSpace. I know Elizabeth has shared some of those resources, and then we'll take on more questions. And then with that said, Elizabeth, do you mind providing me access to the other screen of my computer so we can go and look into the example?
Sure thing. Give me 1 second here.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You should have that come up on your end in just a second. But in the meantime, sharing here what folks have been typing in, and Alicia is sharing, the templates have been very helpful, both the handouts that are available in the handout section of the control panel, those will also be emailed out afterwards, as well as the various links to the sample budgets as well. And it's also been shared, it's always really helpful to have a conservative budget, but also having a plan B, should costs go over, and being able to provide those answers to funders are just a few of the things that folks have shared in the chat of what they've learned today.
Great, thank you so much. That's very helpful to hear. So with that said, right now you should be seeing the Introduction to Project Budgets handout. We're currently seeing page 2, and then there you'll find some of the basic definitions. But I feel that sometimes, and particularly when you're so in the weeds, I think it's helpful to look at specific example. So I wanted, before we ended up with our last round of questions and answers, to just walk you through an example with the specific numbers and seeing what, going back to how we started saying that grant makers usually go directly to the sample budget, how do they read it, and what are they looking for? So I'm going to do that quick exercise and walk you through what we're seeing on this sample budget, and then we'll have a couple of more minutes for Q&A. I would say, and just if you're right now and have a piece of pen, a piece of paper and a pen, as I walk you through that, you might want to jot down some notes of how this resonates for your specific project. We also have the Intro to Project Budgets exercise, and then you could also use that template for you to do your own. And hopefully while I present this example, you're going to start creating your own project budget. And later, after the webinar finishes, you can continue working on your own. Without further ado, let's read and see what this sample budget is. So I would say the first thing, a funder would do is they would go down and look at the total expenses. You know, okay, how much money is this project gonna cost? So here we see that in the case of this particular example, this project costs around $200,000. Then here you want to see how much of that is personnel. So we see that roughly 84,000 is personnel costs. And then sometimes, and I say this, you might want to add some percentages, and that goes into the indirect and direct costs. But then this is roughly a, so that's, as I was saying, this is a significant amount of the expenses. What we also see when we look at the personnel cost is that we have the executive director involved, we have the program director, a program assistant, and then some tutors. We see that the executive director is going to be involved only 10%, similar to the example we provided today. The program director is going to be full-time. They're going to be working for $45,000 a year in this particular example. They're going to have a program assistant that is going to support the program director only 50% of the time, and that's going to cost $15,000. And then they're going to need 2 tutors for the program, and then those tutors are going to be only working 25% of their time in this specific project for a total of $10,000. Here then we see the subtotal for this particular organization, and again, it is based on your organization. This one has a fringe rate of 11%, so then they're adding the fringe rate, so you know that they're getting 11% of the benefits, and then that's how we come to the total. And as you can see, you can quickly see that there is roughly 5 people involved in the project and how they're going to be involved just by looking at the numbers. Then we see non-personnel cost. We see that they're going to be evaluating the work, and that they're contracting a consultant. For the consultant to do that work, that's $11,000. And I feel here, going back to talking about the true costs, as you know, once you're giving the grant and they want to show, you want to show what your impact is, and this is very common that people hire outside people. So just whatever you anticipate is going to bring an expense, make sure that you account for it. Many organizations might not estimate well either the amount of time their own personnel are going to be involved in the project and or other outside people's involvement. So just be mindful of that and be realistic. And I think here, going back to the question of people that are starting, do it to the best of your knowledge. The other thing I would recommend there, if you're not sure, talk to somebody that has experience putting together budgets, and then they might also give you a quick overview if that's a realistic budget or not. Then we have this particular project has a social worker, has additional volunteers in the form of tutors, so they are adding the value-based. And you see, we quickly see how many, there's 2 tutors, how much they're charging, and you very quickly, without too many details, understand the project. So they're going to be doing 4 hours for 36 weeks. So, and again, we don't know, this might be a longer project, but it gives you a lot of information. Then we have supplies and material, printing, postage, travel, food and beverages, program equipment, program space, and that adds to $80,000. So we've covered the expenses, and then we know, okay, what is this? How are they going to make this program come to life? This particular example is about some tutoring programs for students. So yeah, I feel that's in terms of their expenses. Now, if we move to the income, how are they gonna fund this project? So we go back first, grants and contributions. You should be seeing it at the top. For this particular project, you see that they have different sources of income. They are having individual donations, which is the biggest contributor of source of income for this particular project with roughly 45,000. Then we have 37,000 for the foundations. They have some corporate funding also available for this particular project. And then they have federated giving programs of 2,000. And I think here, going back to what I was saying, make sure that you add the value of the money that you have confirmed. And again, for this one, you would assume that this 37 is what they're going to be applying for the grant for. But then you quickly see, and again, it depends on which type of funder you're applying. But then in this case, that's what this budget is telling me. And then the total income for this is going to be 101,000 roughly. In addition, from grants and contributions, they have some earned income from publications and products of roughly 2,500. And then they have around 20,000 in-kind support, mainly from volunteers and space. The total project, oh my God, the project is 123,660, and here I say amount to be raised 74. So that's what they're looking for funding. So probably I delete what I said. This 37 is not the grant application. It's here down below. They're looking for $74,000. So, and here they might be applying for a grant of that value or for half of it. It depends on what their fundraising strategy is. And then as you see, usually the total income is the same as the expense. And I feel that that's also an important point to have as you're doing your project. And then you want to make sure that you're not have higher expenses than your income. And with that said, Elizabeth, what are the questions coming in, and what do participants want to know more about?
Yes, Eileen had a really great question that I think you just kind of gestured to, so thank you for the segue. And she wants to know, when applying to multiple funders for the same project, how do you handle being funded by more than one of them? Are we asking each of the funders for the full amount of the project? Are we asking them for only a percentage of them? You know, do we only accept half of the gift so you can balance out and only take the amount of money that's needed for the project? So I guess the question here is, how many funders should you apply for each project, and how much should you ask for?
So I would say when we look at the grant making process, I think there are 4 steps. The first one is know what you're going to be applying for, and I feel this project budget is a good example. So you know that you have your project, you know that you're going to be looking for $74,000. You know that that's what you need right now. Once you know that, what's going to determine if you apply to 1 or 2 or 3 funders is the research phase of prospects. You might already have relationship with past donors, and we always encourage just work with your past funders and past supporters to fundraise. But then if that's not the case, and this is a new project, or they don't have the capacity to fund this project, that's when you do the prospecting. And unfortunately, that's where when you do what we call the dance, then you have to go and seek, okay, what's your timeline? What is out there? Is there actually a grant maker that's going to be willing to fund that amount? And based on the project, you might be, when you're doing your research, you might find that there is a funder that actually has a grant around that size, and then you should start looking for a funder that is around that size of grant. But sometimes when you start looking, and based on the timing of your project, you might see that, okay, I didn't find that. I found 2 that are, let's say in this case, 30,000 and then the other 45,000. So that's, I would say that that's dependent on what you see as you're doing your prospect. I would recommend that you always try to do 1 or 2. I don't feel that, depending on the size, this is a 200,000 grant on average in the US, and when you do those averages, it's also very broad, but on average, the most common grant in the US is $35,000. And again, you could have a $5 million grant, or you could have a $50 grant. So I would say that depends very specific on your project. I would recommend that you try to fundraise just from one grant and don't involve that many grants unless it's a big project. And when I talk a big project, is over, when you have projects over $500,000 or over the millions, then you have to pull resources from various sources in order to pull that off. And I'm keeping an eye on the time. I think that's Elizabeth, I don't know, we have questions, time for one more question or not.
I'm hoping this one is an easy one. When it comes to the actual grant writing process, when should you put together the budget? Before writing the proposal or after writing the proposal?
I feel that that's depending on how many people are involved in the process, depending on how much information you have. I wouldn't say, I don't want to say that there, I would say whatever works best for the organization and how you operate. It definitely have to make sense together. So I would recommend doing in parallel, but it depends on the staff that you have and how much, on the staff that you have and how much information. I wouldn't say they will go parallel.
Great.
Thank you so much. Or you could go the other way. You could have the project and then the description.
And with that, don't miss out on any trainings that we do have coming up. You can subscribe to our GrantSpace newsletter. Thank you so much to everyone for taking time out of their day to join us today. Thank you so much, Catalina, for sharing your expertise with our audience. With that, thank you, everyone. Be well, be safe.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for putting this, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today.